For a French knight, the most terrifying sound in the world wasn't a war horn. It was the wet, crunching sound of a weaver's club crushing the helmet of the man next to him. This is the story of how an army of shopkeepers, armed with simple clubs and pure hatred, systematically slaughtered the greatest warriors in Europe, and it all started with a secret password in a sleeping city. 2 months before the battle, on the morning of May 18th, 1302, the Mattins bell rang out for dawn prayers across the wealthy, resentful city of Bruges. But this was not a call to worship, it was a signal for slaughter. In the hushed pre-dawn light, bands of Flemish rebels, led by a weaver who had become a revolutionary, moved like ghosts through the alleys. They carried hidden weapons and a simple, brutal test. Bursting into homes and inns, they dragged dazed French soldiers and officials from their beds. The question was always the same, a phrase whispered with deadly intent: shield on friend, shield and friend. To a native Fleming, the guttural sounds were as natural as breathing. To a French tongue, they were an impossible knot. Those who stumbled, whose pronunciation betrayed them, were cut down where they stood. The massacre was swift, personal, and merciless. The city, which had awakened to the gentle sound of prayer, was now filled with screams. The canals, normally reflecting the elegant guildhalls, began to run red. By the time the sun was fully risen, over 2,000 were dead. The Mattens of Bruges was a shocking, savage declaration of independence, written in blood on the cobblestones. When news of the massacre reached the royal court in Paris, it was met with stunned disbelief, which quickly curdled into incandescent rage. The French king, Philip IV, known as the Fair, was a man of cold piety and absolute will. He saw himself as God's chosen instrument of order. The slaughter in Bruges was not just a rebellion, it was a blasphemous assault on the divinely ordained structure of the universe, where commoners obeyed and nobles ruled. Before his silent, terrified court, the king swore an oath. He would not merely punish Flanders, he would erase it. He vowed to lead an army north and personally oversee the extermination of its people, to burn their cities to the ground until not one stone was left on another. The army he assembled was a spectacle of power, the very embodiment of the medieval world order. Led by France's most esteemed military commander, Count Robert II of Artois, it was a river of steel and silk. 2,500 knights and their squires answered the call, the cream of French nobility. These were men who had been trained for war since they could walk, whose entire existence was a performance of martial prowess. Their armor, polished to a mirror shine, was worth a fortune, each plate a masterpiece of the smith's art. Their great war horses, destriers bred for size and strength, were worth even more. This was not just an army, it was a social class mobilized for war. They were backed by 8,000 infantry, a formidable force that included the most feared missile troops in Europe, the elite Genoese crossbowmen. For 300 years, the French heavy cavalry had been the apex predator of the European battlefield. They had shattered armies from the Holy Land to the fields of Italy. The idea that they could be challenged, let alone defeated, by a mob of weavers and butchers was not just unlikely, it was laughable. For the knights marching north, this was not a war. It was a hunt, a pest control operation. They had no idea they were marching toward their own extinction, and the reason for their doom wasn't a bigger army or a stronger castle. It was a 5-foot-long piece of wood with a nail in it. While an army of nobles rode to claim their glory, an army of laborers prepared to die for their homes. The Flemish force that gathered to meet the French tide was something new in the world. It was not a feudal levy sworn to a lord, but a citizens' army, a militia of the guilds. Their leaders, William of Ulick and Guy of Namur, were nobles, but the heart and soul of the army were the common men who filled its ranks. The weavers of Ghent stood shoulder to shoulder with the butchers of Bruges, the fishmongers of Dam next to the fullers of Ypres. These were not men who had spent their lives in tournaments. They were men who had spent their lives working, their bodies hardened by physical labor. They could not afford the full plate armor of the knights. Most wore a simple mail shirt or a padded cloth gambeson. Many had nothing more than the thick leather apron of their trade. They were a patchwork army, armed with a motley collection of pikes, spears, and the weapon that would become a legend, the goedendag. The name was a grim piece of Flemish irony, literally meaning good day. It was a brutally simple and effective weapon, a thick wooden staff, about 5 feet long, weighted at the top and capped with a wicked iron spike. It was a hybrid, combining the crushing, bone-shattering power of a mace with the armor-piercing point of a spear. In the hands of a brawny weaver or a butcher, it could fell a warhorse or punch through a helmet's visor. The goedendag was more than a weapon, it was a symbol. It required no noble bloodline, no years of specialized training, no great expense. It was a democratic instrument of death, the physical manifestation of the common man's fury. Any man with strong arms and courage could use it to kill a knight who had been bred for war since birth. It was the great equalizer. But a weapon, no matter how brutal, is useless without a strategy. And the Flemish plan was something no knight in his right mind could have ever predicted. But the true strength of the Flemish army was not in their weapons, but in their hearts. They were driven by a force the French nobility could not comprehend, absolute desperation. For the French knights, this was a campaign for glory and vengeance. For the Flemish craftsmen, it was a fight for survival. They knew what defeat meant. It meant their homes would be burned, their workshops destroyed, their wives and children put to the sword. King Philip's oath of extermination was not a secret. They had nowhere to retreat, no other place to call home. This was their land, and they would either die defending it, or they would live as free men. They were an army of fathers and sons, of neighbors and colleagues, bound together by a fierce love for their cities and a burning hatred for their oppressors. They knew they were probably marching to their deaths, but they marched anyway, a tidal wave of righteous fury, ready to meet a river of steel. These stories of how common people shape history are often forgotten. If you want to make sure these incredible tales continue to be told, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. As this unlikely army of laborers marched to face the greatest military machine of their age, their only true armor was their unity, and their only real hope lay hidden in the earth itself. The French knights saw an open field, perfect for a cavalry charge. They saw a rabble of peasants waiting to be slaughtered. They had no idea the Flemish had already won the battle the night before with shovels. The Flemish commanders chose their ground with a craftsman's eye for detail. They positioned their army on a plain near Kortrijk, strategically flanked by the Leie River and a series of marshy streams. This geography would naturally funnel the French charge into a bottleneck, preventing the larger, more mobile army from surrounding them. But their true genius lay in what they did next. Under the cover of darkness on the night of July 10th, thousands of Flemish militiamen put down their weapons and picked up shovels. All through the night, they worked in disciplined silence, digging a network of cunningly hidden ditches and pits across the entire frontage of the battlefield. These were not massive, obvious trenches. They were irregular, shallow, and deliberately concealed with a thin layer of turf and branches. From a distance, the field looked perfectly flat and ideal for a cavalry assault. In reality, it was a death trap. It was an act of brilliant, unorthodox warfare, a tradesman's solution to a warrior's problem. As dawn broke on July 11th, the Flemish army took its position behind their hidden defenses. They formed a deep, dense phalanx, a solid wall of men and weapons. The long pikes formed a bristling hedge in the front ranks, while behind them, thousands more held their goedendags ready. The militia of each city stood together, their colourful guild banners snapping in the breeze, the Lion of Flanders, the emblems of Bruges and Ghent. They looked less like a traditional army and more like a medieval corporation prepared for a hostile takeover. When the French army arrived and their commanders surveyed the scene, they were filled with contemptuous confidence. The sight of the Flemish commoners, standing there on foot, without a cavalry screen, provoked laughter among the French nobles. In the rigid doctrines of medieval warfare, an army without knights was not an army at all. It was simply a mob waiting to be trampled. A few of the more experienced French commanders, seeing the marshy ground, urged caution. They suggested letting the Genoese crossbowmen go first, to soften up the Flemish line with a devastating volley of bolts from a safe distance. But the commander, Robert of Artois, would not hear of it. He was a proud, arrogant man, and his mind was clouded by a fatal case of class prejudice. To him, the very notion of using professional soldiers to thin out a peasant mob was an insult. The glory of this day belonged to the nobility. He reportedly sneered at the suggestion, declaring, "Should we let merchants' blood stain our swords when we could simply ride them down like wheat?" The French knights roared their approval. They demanded the honor of the first and only charge. This was their right, their purpose. The idea that shopkeepers could even momentarily stand against the flower of French chivalry was an absurdity. They saw not soldiers, but an opportunity to assert their natural superiority. As they prepared for the charge, adjusting their helmets and lowering their visors, they were completely unaware that the very ground beneath their horses' hooves was about to betray them. The air grew thick with tension, the quiet resolve of the Flemish facing the boisterous arrogance of the French. The stage was set for a slaughter, but no one knew who was about to be the butcher and who was the cattle. Noon, July 11th. A trumpet blast cut through the summer air. The ground began to tremble. The French line moved forward, first at a trot, then a canter, and then a full, earth-shattering gallop. 2,500 of the world's greatest warriors became a single, unstoppable avalanche of steel and horseflesh. The sun glinted off a forest of lowered lances as each knight chose his target, a specific Flemish peasant to impale, a single life to be snuffed out in the pursuit of glory. Across the field, the Flemish line stood absolutely still, a silent, unmoving wall of defiance. They held their pikes and go-dendags steady, their knuckles white, their hearts pounding. They waited. 50 yards from impact, the glorious charge collided with grim reality. The first wave of French warhorses hit the network of hidden ditches. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. The magnificent animals, symbols of knightly power, screamed as their legs snapped like twigs, catapulting their heavily armored riders headfirst into the mud. The second line, charging blindly behind them, had no time to stop. They crashed violently into the first, creating a horrifying pileup of men and beasts. The third line piled into the second. Within moments, the most powerful cavalry charge in Europe had devolved into a chaotic, writhing, screaming mass of broken horses and hopelessly trapped knights. Men encased in 60 pounds of meticulously crafted steel, who had been masters of their world a moment before, were now helpless, their invincibility a forgotten dream. Panic set in. The weight of their armor became a death sentence, dragging them down in the muddy water, the elegant visors of their helmets now filling with filth, their muffled cries for help swallowed by the chaos. Then, the Flemish surged forward. It was not a heroic charge. It was a wave of unleashed hatred. The guild militiamen fell upon the trapped and struggling French knights, and what followed was less a battle than a methodical, industrial slaughter. The spiked clubs rose and fell in a grim, steady rhythm. The weavers of Ghent, accustomed to the coordinated work of the loom, swung their godendags in unison. The butchers of Bruges, with a chilling efficiency, applied the skills of their trade to new materials. The sound, as chroniclers later wrote, was like 1,000 blacksmiths hammering at once, a continuous deafening clang and crunch of steel being smashed and bone being broken. Knights who had never known fear in their lives begged for mercy, but their pleas were lost in a language the Flemish did not speak or chose not to hear. The arrogant commander, Robert of Artois, seeing the disaster, led a final, desperate charge with his personal guard, managing to bypass the worst of the ditches. In a brief display of knightly prowess, he cut his way into the Flemish ranks, only to be dragged from his horse by a Bruges butcher named Willem van Sifting. He was surrounded and methodically beaten to death by a crowd of craftsmen, his expensive armor merely prolonging his agony. His death was the symbolic end of the battle and of an era. The age of chivalry, with all its pomp and glory, drowned in a muddy Flemish field, bludgeoned to death by the very people it was meant to dominate. The idea that common people could outthink and outfight their supposed superiors is a theme that echoes throughout history. What do you think was the biggest factor in the Flemish victory? Their weapons, their strategy, or their desperation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The battle was over, but the killing had just begun. As the screams of the dying faded, and the last pockets of French resistance were extinguished, a new sound emerged on the battlefield of Kortrijk. It was not the cheer of victory, but the quiet, methodical sound of work, the clinking of metal, the cutting of leather, the grim business of craftsmen harvesting the symbols of a dead ideology. They weren't collecting gold or armor, they were collecting proof. The Flemish militiamen moved across the field of carnage, systematically stripping the bodies of the French nobility. But it was not the fine swords or the ornate armor that they prized the most. It was the golden spurs. These spurs were the ultimate emblem of knighthood, awarded to a man upon achieving that coveted rank, a symbol of his elite status, his martial prowess, and his social superiority. With their simple work knives, the same tools they used to cut cloth or butcher meat, the Flemish commoners cut the spurs from the ankles of the dead knights. It was a profound act of social and military desecration. By evening, they had collected over 700 pairs. With every spur they cut, they weren't just taking a trophy, they were dismantling an ideology. The sound of their work knives scraping against steel was the sound of a new age being born. These hundreds of spurs were taken to the Church of Our Lady in Kortrijk and hung from the ceiling in great, glittering bunches, like a grotesque chandelier of humiliation. For 80 years they would hang there, a golden, silent testimony to the day that shopkeepers destroyed chivalry. The scale of the French defeat was almost incomprehensible. More than 1,000 nobles and knights lay dead. The French kingdom was plunged into shock and mourning. Noble houses across the land were suddenly without heirs. It was more than a military catastrophe. It was an existential crisis. The victory at Kortrijk sent a shockwave across Europe. It shattered the centuries-old myth of the invincibility of heavy cavalry. For the downtrodden and the oppressed, the story became a legend, a spark of hope. It was proof that the hands that weave cloth could also unravel the reins of power. If this story of defiance resonates with you, share it with someone who appreciates a great underdog story. These moments in history deserve to be remembered. The tactics used by the Flemish, a disciplined infantry formation, and the use of terrain would be studied and copied. The English, in particular, would learn the lesson well, employing their commoner longbowmen to inflict similar devastating defeats on French knights at Crécy and Agincourt. The Battle of the Golden Spurs did not end feudalism overnight, but it planted the seeds of its destruction. It proved that economic power could be translated into military power, that a motivated army of citizen soldiers fighting for their homes could defeat a professional army of aristocrats fighting for glory. The date of the battle, July 11th, is now the official holiday of the Flemish community in Belgium, a day to remember the moment their ancestors stood firm against impossible odds. That muddy field near Kortrijk became sacred ground, a place where a new idea was born in blood and mud, the idea that a man's worth is not determined by his birth, but by his courage and his will to be free. The modern world, where citizenship rather than bloodline is the basis of military service, began with Flemish craftsmen standing firm against a charge they were never supposed to survive. If you want to see more stories about the incredible battles that shaped our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next.